Welcome again to the Trial of Alec Baldwin podcast. Derek, we left off last time during jury selection. Over the last couple of days, we have seen opening statements and then the first examination, the cross-examination of the prosecutor's main witness, their investigator, whose name is Marissa Poppell. It seems both in the opening, in the opening statements as well as in the first witness's testimony, three unique questions have been raised that are going to be sort of at the centerpiece of the case. First, did Alec Baldwin pull the trigger of the gun that killed Halyna Hutchins? He said he did not. Prosecutors say that he did. Second, should Alec Baldwin have opened the gun to inspect the chamber to ensure it was in fact a cold gun, a non-fireable gun, or a gun that would
non-lethal,
fire,
yes.
a non-lethal gun, as prosecutors insist that he should have? And had he done so, what would he have found inside? Would it tipped him off that it was in fact a gun with potential lethality? And third, regardless of whether it was a cold gun or not, did Alec Baldwin act recklessly by pointing the weapon in the direction of Halyna Hutchins and pulling the trigger? The biggest issue that's come up on the first day of testimony was whether or not he should have opened the gun and then what he would have found inside. And before we get started, just as a general overlay, we've heard a lot about duties, obligations, legal obligations to do things, and then specifically in this case, whether Alec Baldwin had a legal obligation to open the chamber, to look inside. And why is it that these obligations are so important?
So this is incredibly important in this case because remember, it's an involuntary manslaughter case, right? This is his intent as to whether he intended to kill Halyna Hutchins. That's off the table. Obviously, Alec Baldwin...
It's just irrelevant to the discussion.
It's entirely irrelevant.
Right.
That's when you're thinking about sort of traditional homicide cases, murder cases. Did you intend to kill another person? Nobody, including myself and anyone who is rational, thinks that Alec Baldwin wanted to kill Halyna Hutchins. Of course he didn't. This is a tragedy to everyone involved, and he's been emotionally impacted as well. In an involuntary manslaughter case, you're trying to prove someone's conduct was reckless. Reckless relative to what becomes the question. So you have to establish a standard by which his duty of care was breached. And you need to set forth what is the line that he had to sort of
abide by,
and how did he fall short of that? The prosecutor's duty is to show that Alec Baldwin had to do something, didn't do it because he was too reckless, and it resulted in the death. And unless they can establish that, Alec Baldwin will walk out of that courtroom a free man.
And in fact, unless they can establish it, it doesn't even really go to the jury. The judge is listening, and cases are all the time dismissed because the evidence presented against the defendant did not even meet the legal standard for prosecution, notwithstanding what the jury might think about it. It happens all the time. Here, though, when we're talking specifically about the bullets, and that's been the first issue teed up, we're going to get a lot of discussion later on, about whether or not he actually pulled the trigger. He says he did not. If he never pulled the trigger and the gun went off with some sort of a freak accident, there's really no liability for Alec Baldwin. But
different witnesses are going to speak to different questions
Exactly.
that Jason laid out. I thought it was really helpful. He put that pulling the trigger
Alec
issue.
Baldwin did, yeah.
He made that relevant by his interview and his insistence that he didn't pull the trigger. But that's not what this witness was talking about. And as they come out in the case, we'll talk about which question they're really getting at, because that's what you're doing. You're bringing evidence and testimony, and you're putting it forth to establish basically the three questions that Jason laid out.
So during today's testimony, crime scene technician Marissa Poppell testified that when they investigated the scene after the deadly shooting, they actually found that Alec Baldwin's gun had in it not just live rounds, but live and dummy rounds. And actually, there was another actor on the set named Jensen Ackles, and Jensen Ackles' gun also had live rounds and dummy rounds. A complete disaster for Halyna Hutchins, the armorer who's already been prosecuted, as well as the person who provided the ammunition for the dummy ammunition for the set. There was a major screw up here by allowing live rounds to be intermixed with dummy rounds. We'll get to Alec Baldwin's culpability in a second, but that's an absolute disaster.
Absolutely. And look, there was testimony yesterday as well, and you'll hear a lot about the cart that was brought out with the weapons on it and how it was in total disarray. Yes. There were real bullets mixed with dummy rounds. This is a disaster. No one thinks that any real bullet should have been on set in the first place, because the potential, because of how similar they look, they're intended to look real. You know, you're trying to film something that is a Western. You're trying to add stakes to it. It's not a cartoon, so you want things to look real, and to mix real bullets with live bullets is a disaster waiting to happen.
Now, there's also no allegation or suspicion that Alec Baldwin knew there were real bullets and live bullets and dummy bullets mixed together. He thought they were all dummy bullets by all indications. But Interesting piece of testimony that came out today. Had Alec Baldwin opened the chamber, he would have seen two different colored bullets or parts of the bullets, one designated in the live rounds, one designated in the dummy rounds, and maybe could have actually asked the question, why are these different? And that would have saved your life.
That's right. This is what they're trying to plant in the jurors' minds, at least, is that if Alec Baldwin would have opened this gun, it's an old-fashioned revolver. So if he would have pulled the barrel aside, he would have seen 3 bullets that had all gold backing and 1 bullet that had a gold ring and a silver dot in the center. The silver dot in the center indicated that it was a live round. Now, to someone like Alec Baldwin, he has no idea what the colors of on a bullet represent in any fashion, and nor do any layperson, specifically an actor. That's why you have an armorer on the set who is supposed to check these things because they might be able to tell the difference between different types of bullets, what's a live round, what's a dummy round. Now, the reason, though, I think they're putting this testimony out is they do look different to the naked eye. And what I've posited, and Jason and I have discussed this offline a little bit, is if he had just opened the barrel and seen that the two things look different, would that have prompted him to say, hey, why are 3 bullets have a gold back? I'm a dummy here, but one of these has a silver. Is that okay? Maybe then Seth Kenny or Hannah Gutierrez-Reed, one of the people who do know what the hell they're doing, could have come up and said, oh my God, that's a live round. Thanks for telling us, Alec.
Yeah.
And maybe she would be alive today.
So this is when we get into the question of duty that we talked about earlier in the pod. Did Alec Baldwin have an obligation, a legal obligation, to open the back of that gun and look inside? Now, you brought up a really good point earlier, which is we would immediately say, no, he's an actor. But if, let's say, I was an actor on set and somebody told me I had a cold gun in my hand, but I'm going to put it in my own mouth and pull the trigger, it's a suicide scene.
Yep.
You damn bet I would have opened the back of that gun and looked to see what was inside of it and just double checked the armorer's statement that it's cold. Didn't he have that?
Don't know.
Even if I don't know, wouldn't he have had that same obligation to a third party, Helena Hutchins, who was standing just a few feet away from him?
Yeah, this is the fascinating question. We've been turning this over in our mind. Should he have the same obligation that most ordinary people, and that's a standard you'll hear that's applied in cases like this? What would an ordinary person do, or what is the custom in the industry? I would check that bullet before I put it to my head, and maybe it's slightly less when you're pointing it at someone, but should it be less? Should we design our society for it to be less? All that's going to go out the window, though, because the duty has to be established. He has to have fallen short of something that was an established custom on the set, right? And if
just on set, maybe in the movie industry, large, yeah.
And if they're able to adduce enough evidence that we film movies all the time, there's westerns, there's all sorts of crime movies. That's never done. It's going to be hard to say that he had a duty to do it in this movie just because an accident happened.
I think of the 3 questions we answered, this is the one that tilts most heavily in Alec Baldwin's favor. I just can't imagine that it is the duty of any actor, and Alec Baldwin, by everything we've heard, really doesn't have much knowledge of firearms. That any actor the duty is imposed upon them to double check what the expert says.
Yeah.
Right? The expert told him that it was a cold gun. Non-lethal gun, no way anybody can get hurt. The idea that every actor, and think about a Marvel movie where thousands of people are carrying around guns on set, do they all have the obligation to open them up, to look what's inside and check to make sure it's non-lethal? And then even if they do have that obligation, which I don't think we think that there is, what would he have even seen in there? He would have seen 2 different colored bullets. So what?
He might not have known.
Yeah.
I think he might have said like, oh, it looks weird or prove to me or something. But you're right. He's not the expert. He's the layperson. Now, I do think there's a difference between what Alec Baldwin faces in terms of criminal penalties and what will happen in a post-Rust world. There may be a change in the industry after this case just so we don't have people die. Maybe there will be an expectation that actors check their guns. But that's different than whether Alec Baldwin, when this film was shot, had that obligation.
So one last point, and then we can wrap up. The biggest pre-trial ruling
This is hanging over everything.
Is that the prosecution cannot introduce evidence that Alec Baldwin was an executive producer on the movie. They cannot bring that up. If they were able to bring that up, the sloppiness of the set, the fact that bullets live and dummy were intermixed, all of that could in fact be used against him to show that he ran a sloppy set and he's ultimately responsible for that set. And I think real liability was hanging over his head for that. And because the prosecution can't argue that, can't even mention it to the jury, I think that really hampers their ability to get a conviction.
I think they're entirely hamstrung. How critical that motion was, you can already see in this first witness who's talking about the sloppiness of the set. And I'm thinking to myself, all of this is irrelevant as to whether Alec Baldwin on set, in his capacity as an actor, had an obligation to make the cart not as sloppy, to ensure that the safety training protocols were done on time. He's an actor. He's an employee on the set, not the guy running the entire show. And if you can't adduce that evidence to show that he was reckless with respect to how the entire set looked, you're really hampered and you're limited to proving a case that he shouldn't have pointed the gun at her and he shouldn't have pulled the trigger during the rehearsal. I think that latter question will get a lot closer than this one. I think it's a hard sell to say Alec Baldwin had to open the barrel of that gun unless you can show that's an industry practice, and I really don't think it is.
So next couple of days, Friday will be the next day of testimony. It's currently Thursday afternoon. Friday will be the next day of testimony, and then into Monday as well. These other questions that I think are more perilous for Alec Baldwin will be raised about whether or not he fell short of his duty by pointing the gun at her, by actually pulling the trigger during a rehearsal scene, which seems maybe it does sort of was unnecessary, does fall below the duty of care that he had. And then this ultimate question of whether or not he pulled the trigger in the first place. That we're going to start seeing testimony come out, expert testimony of whether or not this gun, this old-fashioned gun, was capable of firing without Alec Baldwin pulling the trigger.
Yep.
See you guys soon.